Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for finding the time to talk to us today. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
There are still a few days left. What is that one thing that you would want to accomplish, or what would be your first priority, or the last priority, I should say, before the administration finishes its term in office?
Well, look, all of us who work in the Biden administration are going to sprint through the finish these last few days. We have a full agenda of issues that preoccupy our attention. In my world, that is first and foremost Ukraine. And just today, we are announcing a very strong, perhaps the strongest ever set of sanctions on Russia in the energy sector to include some of the largest Russian oil companies, Gazprom Neft and Surgutneftegas. Those are very, very substantial designations, together with just under 200 vessels from Russia's shadow fleet. So these are going to send a very powerful signal in terms of diminishing Russian revenues that enable its prosecution of the war against Ukraine and will shorten Russia's financial runway, just as we seek to lengthen Ukraine's runway and give it the strength to be able to defend itself over the coming weeks and months. So
Well,
we're not resting on our laurels. We are doing everything possible, including surging assistance to Ukraine, military assistance. You've seen the latest package announced by President Biden. We're now, in terms of total assistance, humanitarian, military, and otherwise, close to $107 billion.
President-elect Trump's nominee for the special envoy to Ukraine and Russia, General Keith Kellogg, said that the goal of the new administration would be to end the war in 100 days from the inauguration. Where do you see the situation? How do you see this goal accomplished by the future administration?
Well, look, I have tremendous respect for General Kellogg and wish him the best of success in his new role once he is appointed after January 20th. He's going to have a tall order in terms of trying to secure a just and lasting and durable peace between Russia and Ukraine. It is one thing to bring Ukraine to the table. And I think the Ukrainians are ready to sit down and talk about a lasting peace that would protect their sovereignty, independence, and democratic character. The question to me is, does Vladimir Putin have any interest in sitting down at that table and negotiating anything other than what he has consistently demanded since the very beginning of this war, which is the complete capitulation of Ukraine and essentially Russian dominance over the country and the government located in Kyiv. So squaring those two demands or requirements is going to be very difficult. Bringing Ukraine is going to be the easier piece,
Mhm.
but getting Russia to engage on something that preserves Ukraine's sovereignty is going to be very, very difficult. It's going to require leverage. You don't do negotiations without leverage, and that means exacting costs and consequences on Russia to include sanctions, further pressure, especially in the energy and financial sectors. And then in terms of military assistance, it will require additional support for Ukraine. I don't see how this gets done outside of those parameters. But of course, this is a question for the new team.
Just to follow up on that, do you think what Biden administration has done to support Ukraine, both militarily, financially, politically, is putting them in a strong position? Let's assume that Russia comes to the negotiating table. Do you think Ukraine is in a strong position at this point to do so?
Well, look, I mean, it's relative. Have we done everything possible to support Ukraine? Yes, we have given every weapons capability, every system, javelins, HIMARS, howitzers, anti-tank capabilities, Abrams tanks, F-16s, and every manner of capability in between. So we have surged, almost $70 billion in security assistance to Ukraine over these roughly 2.5 years of the war. But look, at the end of the day, the situation is still tenuous in many towns. and in the front lines in the Donbass. And why is that? It is for a very simple reason. There is a manpower equation that is at the heart of this calculation as to who is gaining ground in this war. And Russia simply comes at this war with a lot more bodies, a lot more personnel than Ukraine does. And so that is a factor, a challenge that is very difficult. You can provide all the capabilities you want, but at the end of the day, surmounting that critical roadblock is simply very, very challenging. And
Yeah.
so we find ourselves in a situation where Ukraine, yes, it's strong, but it faces an adversary that, despite the colossal casualties that it's suffering, is able to eke out some gains in the East day by day, week by week.
Yeah. And let's assume that there's a ceasefire achieved in 100 days. What does that mean for Ukraine in your view, and what does it mean for Russia?
Well, I think a ceasefire would be a tremendous and very significant accomplishment if it were to be reached. I have to say, I'm very reluctant or hesitant to foresee a situation where we are able to achieve a ceasefire in 100 days' time. Um, I mean, look, Putin's aims here, as I stated at the outset, have been to subjugate Ukraine. This system of filtration that has been implemented in the Donbass and in the occupied territories of Zaporizhia and Kherson and Crimea, importantly, is a brutal system of pacifying Ukrainians and trying to eradicate their national consciousness. This is not the sort of thing that happens spontaneously. This is a centrally directed effort to erase Ukrainian identity. And it's just, I find it very strange. There's this magical thinking that is going on, at least in some parts of this town and in some European capitals as well, that suggests that perhaps, in spite of this sort of maniacal drive to subjugate Ukraine, that at the end of the day, that the Russians can simply live with some variety of compromise that results in a ceasefire and some diminished set of aims on their end. I don't think that's realistic.
President-elect Trump has stated that he would want the NATO allies to increase their defense spending to 5% of their GDP. How realistic do you think that is?
Well, look, I think it's imperative that a lot of European countries spend more on their defense industrial base. They need to invest in capabilities. They need to invest in production so that they have the weapons and the munitions to be able to defend themselves. These last 35 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall have brought about a peace dividend that is both positive, but has left many European countries woefully unprepared for what we're now seeing in Ukraine, which is the largest land war in Europe since World War II. Now, many of those countries are not fighting in this war. They are merely providing support to Ukraine. But even there, we see that they're just simply unable to sustain the levels of support that are needed for this scale and type of conflict. So yes, Europeans need to spend a lot more on defense. There's no doubt about that. There's no free riding any longer in terms of the U.S. providing the predominant extended deterrence and defense capabilities for the alliance. There's got to be a lot more burden sharing. And we've come a long way under the Biden administration. Remember, this administration started with 9 allies spending 2% of their GDP on defense. It ends with 23 allies spending that amount. So we've come a long way. We need to go further. I think the president-elect is right in that sense. But it'll be up to allies to decide, what the benchmark is and how many of them can actually meet that. 5% seems awfully high, given that many struggle to get to 2%. So there's 3 and there's 4% that are in between as benchmarks. But ultimately, I think the bottom line here is, yes, a lot more needs to be invested in defense, and also in the U.S., where our defense industrial base definitely needs to be energized to sustain the sorts of conflicts in the future that we might potentially see.
And now let's again briefly talk about Georgia. Georgia has very dramatically pivoted towards Russia, China, Iran in the past couple of years probably. What do you think happened? How was this possible for Georgia to shift so dramatically in the opposite direction? And was it possible for the administration to do something to prevent it?
Look, I think it's what's happening in Georgia is a real tragedy. This was a shining beacon of democracy and robust civil society, free speech, just a wonderful country with a very, very educated citizenry, very determined to integrate into Euro-Atlantic institutions. And then that process was derailed. It was derailed by a small group of leaders who have led Georgia away from the aspirations of the vast, overwhelming majority of its citizens, knowing that their actions are jeopardizing the future of the country. And that's the real tragedy here. So you've seen the United States take strong actions to sanction a number of Georgian individuals, close to 100 now, in terms of our visa policy. We've also used explicit sanctions against some of the key architects of this U-turn away from NATO and the EU, and as you noted, towards China, Russia, Iran, and other autocratic powers. And the real architect of this policy has been Bidzina Ivanishvili, who, as honorary chairman of the Georgian Dream Party, has really pulled the strings on a lot of the key decisions that have been made in Tbilisi over the course of the last few months, but also over the course of the last dozen or so years. And so what we saw was a gradual, widening gap over the years between the rhetoric of the government, which purported to want to integrate with NATO and the EU, and actions that seemed a little bit dissonant with that. And then dramatically, within the last 6 months, we've seen a complete U-turn with legislation to try to criminalize civil society, to try to criminalize LGBTQ relationships, to permit dark money to flow from overseas into Georgia, and then, repressions against protesters and the rest of what we've seen over the last 45 days. So as I said at the outset, this has been a real tragedy because it has been the snuffing out, if it continues, and I hope it doesn't. But if it continues on this trajectory, the government is clearly attempting to snuff out the last embers of democracy in Georgia. And that would be a tragedy for everybody in the region and beyond.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, Biden administration has imposed sanctions, both financial and travel restrictions. Are there any more sanctions coming up, like you announced at the
Well,
top
I
our
never,
conversation?
I can never speak to future sanctions actions. That's U.S. policy. But I also would not exclude that there will be additional sanctions in the very near term. And what I would say here on this point is that there is a very strong bipartisan push from Congress to implement more sanctions and impose more consequences on the architects of this policy of repression. You've seen it coming from the Helsinki Commission. You've seen it coming from other quarters in Congress, and it is bipartisan because at the end of the day, this new group of Georgian leaders is trying to align with China, Russia, and Iran, and that is not in the interest of the United States, no matter what political party you're from. And so I think we will see additional actions in the coming weeks and months, but I have nothing to preview for you today.
Well, Ambassador Carpenter, thank you very much for your time. Good luck to you in the coming days and months and years, and I do appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having me.